With it being Mistborn May, I really want to do a Mistborn themed video, so I've come up with the Allomancy book tag. So what this tag is going to be is I'm going to go through all of the metals in this quick reference guide in the Alloy of Law, and using this quick reference guide, I'll list what the allomantic power is that the metal provides, and then come up with a prompt for that metal. I will break this video down into two halves. The first half is going to be the 9 allomantic metals that are mentioned in the Final Empire, so Mistborn Book 1. And then the second half is going to be all the metals that are remaining in this reference guide. So if you want to avoid the spoilers or what any of the other metals are because you haven't read past Book 1, feel free to skip that section, although I don't think it will be all that spoilery. So with that said, let's get started. And we got the first metal is iron, pulled on nearby metals. So for this prompt, I'm looking for a book that you pulled forward on your TBR. One of those books that was sitting on your shelf and it was just calling to you to be read. You had no plans of reading it, but it was just calling to you and just saying, hey, pick me up. And for me, that book was Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It used to be sitting on my shelf right here. So I was seeing it all the time while I was working, and I had no plans of picking it up anytime soon for obvious reasons. I wasn't even looking to buy the book when I did, but I saw it for a really good deal, and I couldn't pass it up. So I bought it, and then it spent a few months sitting on that shelf, and eventually I couldn't put it off any longer, and I pulled into my TBR when, again, I had no plans to. Next prompt is steel. Pushes on nearby metals. So the opposite of iron. For this one, I'm looking for a book that you keep pushing back on your TBR. You say you're going to read it, but then you push it back farther and farther and farther. And for me, that is Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. The original plan was to read Malazan in 2022 and then 2023, and now it's getting pushed to probably 2024. It's just one of those series that I've heard is so complex and so large that you really have to be in the right mindset to read it, and I don't think I'm there right now. I've really been preferring simple, easy reads at the moment. Prompt number 3 is tin. Increases the 5 senses. So for this, I'm looking for a book that you picked up and read because the cover caught your attention, and I'm going with Dune by Frank Herbert. I didn't really like the book. I think I gave it 3 stars. And I would normally have unhauled a book that I felt that way about. I'm not a big sci-fi fan to begin with. But I absolutely love this cover. And there's no way I'm going to be giving this book away. Honestly, the main reason I read the book was because I wanted to own the book with this cover. So this was absolutely a cover buy. And that's the only reason I still own it. Prompt number 4 is Pewter. Increases physical abilities. So for here, I'm looking for a massive tome of a book. Now, all 3 of these books are pretty large books. They don't even hold a candle to this next book, which is Superpowered's Year 4. It's almost 2,000 page book. Definitely the largest book I own by several hundred pages. Prompt number 5 is Zinc. Zinc riots emotions. So what's a book you read that just made you really emotional, made you feel all the emotions? And for me, I'm going to go away from the obvious answer here and go with Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is a classic, more, I guess you could call it sci-fi, about an experiment to make someone who is quite literally mentally disabled or mentally retarded and turn them into a genius. And this is his journey going from this sweet little innocent guy to the most brilliant person on earth, and just seeing how his world changes through that process and the results of the experiment. Now prompt 6 is going to be the opposite of Zinc. You got Brass, soothes emotions. So I'm looking for a cozy comfort read, a really calming book. And is there any answer better than Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree? This is the definition of a cozy comfort read. So I couldn't think of any book I would rather place in this category than Legends and Lattes. The 7th prompt is Copper, which hides allomantic abilities. So for this prompt, I'm looking for a book that you've hidden or guilty pleasure, or just a book you've read that you really don't advertise that you've read. Maybe it's one that's completely outside of your general genre. Maybe it's one you're embarrassed about. For whatever the reason, you don't really promote the fact that you've read this book. For me, that's going to be The Rosie Project. I think I read it in 2022 because of a reading challenge I was in. I can't remember the category, but I know I read the book, and I surprisingly liked it. I think I gave it 4 stars. I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty confident on that. It is a romance book, and I'm pretty sure, I think it's safe to say it's the only true romance book I've ever read. And I don't see myself reading any more romance books, but that would be my hidden book. Prompt number 8 is going to be Bronze Reveals Allomantic Pulses. So for this, I'm looking for a book that you buddy read. The opposite of Copper, where you hide the book. Instead, I want one that you've actively read with someone else. And I'm going with the Yamaneska series by Bendalloy. This is a series that myself and Jordan the Boiled Jellyfish are actively buddy reading with a bunch of people on the Wizardly Duo Discord. And then the 9th and final prompt for the first half of this is Atium, which reveals someone else's future. So for here, I'm looking for a book that you read but had a major plot point or the ending spoiled for you, where you knew what was going to happen. And unfortunately for me, that book was Ruin by John Gwen, the 3rd book in Faithful and the Fallen. No one flat out told me what was going to happen, but enough booktube language was used to say what they wanted to say without actually saying what happened that I pretty much knew how this was going to end. So this was my probably biggest spoiler I received since being on booktube. So those are the first 9 prompts. I am going to continue with the next 9 prompts. So if you've only read The Final Empire, might want to stop now. But again, I don't think it's going to be too big of a spoiler if you hear what the medals are and what their ability provides. I'm not going to go into details about how any of these were actually used in the books. So up to you if you want to continue or not. But I will be moving on in 3, 2, 1. All right, moving on to the higher metals, we're going to start with Cadmium, which slows down time. For this prompt, I'm looking for a book that you lost track of time reading. You were so immersed in the book and just loving reading it that you had no idea how much time went by while you were reading it. And for me, that's Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, book 1 of the Farseer trilogy and book 1 of Realm of the Elderlings overall. Again, when I read this, I was on vacation in Hawaii, so it was extremely peaceful reading this while sitting next to the ocean and watching and listening to the waves. It was probably one of the more peaceful experiences of my life and easily lost track of time while reading this book. Now, the opposite of Cadmium is Bendalloy, which speeds up time. So I'm looking for a book that you read faster than you expected to. And I'm going to go with The Legend of Blackjack by A.R. Witham. When I picked this up, I was in a reading slump and reached out to my friend Andrew at Andrew's Wizardly Reads, and I asked him for a self-pub recommendation for a book that would get me out of the slump, and he said to give Legend of Blackjack a try. Without hesitation, this was the first book that came to mind, and I went into it with very low expectations. It was already in a slump, and then it was a YA portal fantasy. Not something I read. I loved it. Ended up reading the whole thing in, I think, 2 days. Moving on to prompt number 12, you have Gold. See your own past. So for this prompt, I'm looking for a book from your past that you may have liked more if you had made a different choice. Maybe that's reading the physical or listening to the audio instead of doing the other. Or maybe it's just picking it up at a different time because you were in a slump or you were hungover at that time and it just wasn't the right time to read that book. I'm going with Blood Song by Anthony Ryan. I listened to the audiobook and I think I DNF'd a about 75% in because I realized I hadn't been paying attention for half the book. And the narrator, I think Andrew's name for him is Stephen Bland, because it's a very bland, monotone narration for every book he does. And I'd have to agree. I was not immersed in this book at all. Completely zoned out for hours of it. So maybe if I had physically read the book, which fortunately I have the book so I can still do, I might end up enjoying it. Now the opposite of seeing your own past is seeing your own future, which is Electrum. For this prompt, I want a book that is a 5-star prediction. And there's only one book I can go with for me, and that's Of War and Ruin by Ryan Cahill, the 3rd book of the Bound and the Broken. This isn't just a 5-star prediction for me. This is a top 5 ever book for me. That's what I'm predicting. So maybe I'm setting myself up for failure with that high of expectations, but book 2 is just that good. I'm expecting more of the same, if not an improvement from book 3. Prompt number 14 is Chromium destroys target's allomantic reserves. So what's a book you read based on a recommendation that you ended up DNFing? Or better yet, if you know something, what's a book that you read based on a recommendation that put you in a reading slump? I fortunately haven't had that experience where a recommendation put me in a slump, but there have been recommendations where I've DNF'd the book. So I'm going to go with First Law by Joe Abercrombie. A bunch of you probably already know because I talk about it quite frequently that everyone was recommending First Law. So I picked it up and I didn't enjoy it at all. There just wasn't enough plot for me to get into, and I didn't like any of the characters. So even if they were fascinating, morally gray characters to me, I didn't like them. I didn't care about what would happen to them. And since there wasn't much plot moving the book along, I just didn't care for it. So after reading the first book, I DNF'd the series. And now the opposite of Chromium is Nicrosil, which enhances a target's next metal burned. So I'm looking for a book or a series that was recommended by a friend that you ended up binging the whole thing. You loved it so much you couldn't put it down. I have a few books I could go with for this prompt, but I'm going to go with a series instead, and that's the Alex Verus series by Benedict Jacka, book 1 being Faded. So Andrew told me over and over again within the same week, if I like Dresden as much as I say I like Dresden, I need to give Alex Verus a try. And he was pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. So I gave in, picked up book 1, really enjoyed it, even though I was skeptical. And then the more I read the series, the more I loved it. So this is a series, once I did pick it up, I think I read all 12 books in 2 or 3 months. So if there was any delays, it had nothing to do with the series. It was probably more because I was waiting for a audio hold from Libby. Other than that, I just went from one book to the next, straight on through the whole series. Prompt number 16 is Aluminum destroys your allomantic reserves. So I'm looking for a book or a series that you read that left you hungover after you read it. Nothing else was really working for you because of how good that book or series was before. Stormlight Archive. I realized after reading Stormlight Archive, everything I read initially after it, including a lot more Sanderson, so that was when I picked up Mistborn, Warbreaker, Elantris, I rated all of them low after reading Stormlight Archive. Nothing was living up to the expectations I had set. No book was being deemed good at that point. I had to go back and reread all of those books at another point when I wasn't hungover, and most of them ended up being 5-star reads for me. They just fell victim to being the first books after Stormlight Archive, the first time I tried reading them. Prompt number 17 is Duralumin. This enhances the next metal burned. So a book or series you picked up, not based on a recommendation or a gift, you found and picked up on your own, and you absolutely loved it, and you binged the whole thing. And if you've been watching my videos this year, it'll be no surprise to you that I'm going with Fred the Vampire Accountant by Drew Hayes. This is one I picked up in December, and I finished book 8 in February. I think in total I got through all 8 books in 7 weeks, and the biggest gap was a 3-week gap between book 1 and book 2. After that, it was same thing with Varys, one book right after the other, and just loved it so much and couldn't put it down. And the 18th and the final prompt is Lerasium. This bestows all allomantic abilities. So I'm looking for the book, if you can pinpoint one book that really got you into fantasy. The book that made you want to pick up more fantasy books. I'm going with Eye of the World or Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Now, it didn't necessarily get me wanting more fantasy books, but when I had some Audible credits I needed to use, the first thing I thought of was, well, Sanderson did a good job of finishing Wheel of Time. Let me see if he can do anything good on his own. And that led me to picking up Stormlight Archive. Stormlight Archive led me to finding BookTube, which then led me to finding almost every fantasy book I've read over the last 2.5 years. But it all began with Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. All that's left is to tag some channels, and since this is a new tag, I'm going to go big and tag 10 people to try and get the ball rolling and get this tag moving in the BookTube world. So to start off with, I'm going to go with Jordan, the boiled jellyfish. Ben at Books with Genghis Khan. Andrew at Andrew's Wizardly Reads. Isa at Fun Fantasy Books. Kay at Kay's Hidden Shelf. Jake, the Bookish Drummer. Trinity at Portable Magic. Theo, the Rekindled Reader. Robert, Punk Rock Cereal Bowl, new channel that I just recently found. And Bryce at Shelf Center. So those are my 10 tags. Make sure you're subscribing to them so you can see when they do this tag as well. And until next time, bye.